We hear a lot about the sort of digital native brands and the disruption that they bring to traditional businesses. How do you think these more established businesses can navigate that wave of disruption that they're facing?
I think it's very difficult, particularly for the smaller companies at the moment, to be able to sort of keep up and retain their competitive edge. And it's quite scary that they might sort of have a knee-jerk reaction and jump into it and invest in technologies that may seem to be right, but not necessarily right for them. So I think they need to sort of look very, very carefully and take their time, considering what they need to invest in, and ultimately look at what their end goal is, and just make sure that they're investing wisely and they're doing it obviously in a secure fashion.
Hasani, do you see a big threat from the sort of digital native sector in insurance?
So fortunately, we would see ourselves as that digital native.
You are the problem.
Yes, so we're part of that challenge. We're part of that train, as it were. And I do think that the digital giants, as they were, they do pose a different type of threat, but they also create different opportunities. And I do think for the established traditional businesses, they are having to go through different transformations to respond. But I also do think that for the smaller players, it doesn't level the playing field to a certain extent, because it makes some of these technologies and services more accessible than they've ever been in the past. Traditionally, you'd have to have very significant contracts with your Oracles and your Microsofts and your big providers. Whereas now you can start up much smaller and see if it works for your business. Mm-hmm. However, the choice is endless. And I think that is something that is quite disruptive for a number of businesses, whether they're big or whether they're small.
Do you consider yourself to be disruptive? Is that what you're trying to be?
Absolutely. So from our roots, the aim of Simply Business was to make insurance much simpler, hence the name, and more accessible to our clients. The demographic that we target, the smaller businesses, is quite an expensive demographic to service, and therefore by leveraging technology, it makes that a viable opportunity for us, and then it gives our customers the benefits that they need, that they wouldn't traditionally have got in such a simple way. And we see that with a number of our different competitors and other businesses who now also want to service that demographic. The technology allows that to happen, whereas previously that would have been prohibitive.
And do you get any pushback from your more traditional rivals?
Not so much, because our traditional rivals now, they want to be part of that game. And I think a lot of bigger players, that the digital transformation that everybody's trying to go through is because they can see that there is a chest of gold at the end of that rainbow. They're just not quite sure how to navigate towards it. And I think that, to Brian's point, navigating there is a challenge. You don't want to just go all in without knowing what you're doing. And for the traditional players, that's quite a big step, right? You've got a successful business and you want to move to another place that is not so certain. Technology allows you to do that, and for a smaller player, and we've been able to take advantage of that over the last decade, we've been able to move a bit quicker than those bigger players. But no, the bigger players, they want to move. It's just a bit challenging for them.
Let's talk now to you, Ian. I mean, you're at the Natural History Museum. Is that a hotbed of digital native disruption?
Perhaps doesn't quite fit in the mould of the other organisations we're talking about, but there's a little irony perhaps that we're talking about Futuregazing here. And the museum is, looking back at artifacts that date back 4.6 billion years old. However, there's a really strong element of looking to the future, as the museum will be 150 years old in 2031. So I actually see the smaller startups and digital natives as actually playing an important part in an ecosystem, helping a very traditional institution like the museum, but there are plenty of other organisations that have been around for a little while, in the commercial world as well, that can actually take advantage of the technologies that are evolving very rapidly and learn how to use them effectively in a larger organisation.
Is there a sort of ecosystem there where you're able to provide a big platform for, some new disruptive tech perhaps, but you might be unable to be agile enough to create it yourself?
I think it has to be created through the culture of the organisation, finding its own culture of innovation. It's a complex world, so at the moment I'm helping the museum to create its digital twin technology vision. if you like, that's a shorthand way of relating to the fact the museum has lots of sensors, lots of data, lots of things, 86 million objects, 4.2 million digitized, and lots of visitors, and all sorts of information to be tracked and used in the right way. So there are lots of ways that technology can be used, but relying on lots of different platforms, different systems, different types of sensors, data points. So that ecosystem has to be created, I believe, actually, because it's not going to be one platform that does everything. If you have a myriad systems, then you need to make sense of that. I refer to that as regulating the mandala of systems, which is perhaps overcomplicated. So I think the platform has to be created, but it's going to be a system of systems or a combination of people and systems working to a common cause. And so sometimes I think having that common purpose can be quite elusive. So it's really nice to be able to work for some organisations that have very clear purpose, such as protecting the planet or preventing drowning. That really helps people to focus on the purpose and what the platforms or the groupings of systems are to do.
Speaking of multiple systems, let's talk about public transport, shall we? What's your view?
I think the tool is being customer obsessive. I don't think personally, I think these digital natives are not technology firms. I think there's a misnomer personally. I think they understood customers well. So Uber is not a technology firm. They realized that people were tired of waiting for the king taxi to turn up at some point in the middle of the rain, as opposed to make the customer king and call up for the taxi. So I think we need to be customer obsessive and really, really understand customers. We've gone live recently, about a year ago, with a hybrid between a bus and a taxi called demand response transport in the east part of Oxford, because we do realize that people want things on demand more and more, and maybe a traditional bus in the middle of a city does serve a very important purpose. Maybe in the outskirts we need to be a bit more flexible for the customer. Same with Amazon. They understood that people don't particularly like shopping. They like the goods as opposed to the experience of shopping, if that makes sense, in shops. And they used it just through technology. Yeah, I'll give you that.
It's interesting that you mentioned Uber, a controversial company that's caused enormous disruption.
Yeah.
But the tide seems to be turning, doesn't it?
It will.
We're hearing that it's losing its license in London as other cities around the world are starting to scrutinise it. Has it sort of done its bit and then it's going to recede, or where does a firm like Uber go?
We need to be careful, and this is a very personal view. We need to be careful that technology doesn't destroy society. And the problem with some of these firms is that they are destroying our society and our high streets. If you think about Amazon, if we're not careful, there will be no high street anymore, and we will become robots. And the other thing is, they're not very ethical in their behaviors with their employees and so on. Some of them, I'm not, and that's something else to watch out for. We're very proud, for instance, of being a golden status investors on people. And we have a large apprentices scheme, and we do believe in people. We're a people business. I'm not convinced some of these technology giants understand people.
What these firms do seem to understand about people is that people vote with convenience. We all say we want to support our local high street. Then we go to said local high street, see something we like, and what's the first thing we do? Look it up to see if it's cheaper online.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely. Some fantastic points, and I think you're absolutely right in this push to be digital, to go with the next greatest thing, to be able to match our competition or have that competitive edge. There are certain things that we're sort of leaving behind, and you're right. I mean, one of the companies that you mentioned was Amazon, as being one of these digital leaders, and you sort of read the reports in the papers about the way that the staff are being treated and the strikes that they had during Black Friday. And there's an interesting balance there, isn't there? About how can you be a digital disruptor or take advantage of all these new technologies, but at the same time, treat your staff with respect and continue to give them the benefits and the things that they need. It just strikes me at the moment it's quite a vicious world as we push forward, and it's quite a shame. And I mean, you're absolutely right. I think of Argos, for example, when they first came out, and it was like, oh my God, what a completely new way of shopping. This is fantastic. But we've sort of caught up and then overtaken them with the Amazons and the other shops in the world. And I worry that these shops will disappear. So there's no more Woolworths. We used to love going into Woolworths, that mishmash and the pick and mix and everything else, and that's sadly gone. And you got to the point where I went to a local town where I live the other day and went into the shopping centre, and there was only one shop. This place is huge. One shop of any value or any benefit, and the rest of them were just closed.
And that
because
has a
everything's
ripple
online.
effect, because of course if the high street dies, not only the community dies with it, but also there's no need for public transport, there's no need for some of the other traditional kind of the butchers, the bakers, etc. The whole thing dies. So I think there will be a little bit of a reaction at some point in society where people, my 17-year-old goes to the high street and buys things locally.
So could I give a slightly alternative view? Because I think the big corporates taking over different areas has always been the case. I remember maybe 15, 20 years ago when Tesco's was really becoming the force that it is today. And the petitions were, they're killing the high street. So Tesco's is killing the corner shop. That's been there for decades and is no longer able to compete with Tesco's. And Tesco's introduced Club Card, which kind of revolutionized CRM for the retail industry. And now no one talks about Tesco's anymore because they're not the perceived big fish when looking at some of the digital giants. And what I see is that these technologies are just enabling different types of work and different types of opportunity. They may not be as lucrative as what they're replacing, but your 17-year-old may have their own YouTube channel, right? And be starting to create their own communities around what they want to be known for. And they may then start to produce products or produce their own, what they call merch and merchandise and things like that they would want to sell and become a micro business that hopefully one day will be insured by us. And then that's a new type of business that some of these digital platforms have created. Now, is that sufficient to replace the high street and all the industries that evolve around that physical relationship that we have with each other? I think you're right. That's a different type of question for society to answer to.
So before we consign the high street to the museums, which maybe we will, perhaps there is an argument that we're in a period of rebirth here, and our generation is mourning what we've known, but actually the next generation will be creating its replacement.
Well, it's interesting to note that there's more and more interest in the museums these days, and particularly the Natural History Museum, getting up towards 6 million visitors, partly, by the way, helped by tremendous improvements in digital engagement that's possible, fantastic digital product-based team in the Natural History Museum, but also people are now taking interest perhaps more deeply in the issues you're mentioning, the social responsibilities that we have. Are we creating a world that we're going to be happy for? Apparently we have something like 500,000 years perhaps, or who knows, before extinction of the human race, but we can make society whatever we want in the meantime, can't we? But people want to understand more about the history of how we interact with each other and the planet that we're on to shape a better future. So I think that the side effect of the difficulties that we're seeing and the changes in society is getting people to think more deeply than they perhaps had to before.
Let's think a bit about tech right now. We see no shortage of companies willing to invest in technology, but we also see lots of examples of them not really making the most of it or not using it particularly well. What do you think is important in terms of tech for the businesses of the 2020s?
Technology needs a purpose. The biggest issue is often there are areas that see a piece of technology that is quite fancy and they want it. And then they realize, actually, what do we do with this sexy thing now? I'll move on to the next thing. If you use technology with a purpose, and that purpose is your customers and your employees and your business, then it works. If you use tech for tech purpose, it's when I don't think it works. And I'm sure we all have examples of that kind of division between purposeful and purposeless, yeah.
I mean, I characterise that, in our own lives, we might be interested in all sorts of gadgets and things that are quite interesting. You could have your home littered with these things. It's all fun and all exciting. You put some of them in the bin. But in a corporate environment, and no particular organisation, but I see it in all sorts of places where I have discussions with senior execs. There are all sorts of pilots, things that come up to prove a concept, the difficulties, perhaps going back to your platforms and ecosystems, the platform's point about something being reusable, a capability that continues for the future, so the organisation grows and evolves rather than just doing something that starts and stops. That's quite challenging if ideas bubble up in different teams, or it's for a small scale short-term initiative or to solve a problem without being lasting, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you overcome that?
I as a CIO, you may think that I may be tempted by technology.
We'd be right, wouldn't we?
It's the other way around. I spend half my life stopping people from implementing technology for, I was going to say fun. It's not for fun, but you know what I mean, without a real meaning or a real purpose. It's too tempting. There's too many gadgets, too many widgets that are available, and many people are attracted by them without thinking, actually, what can this do for my customers or my employees or my business? Yeah.
Although
Right,
you did describe your hybrid initiative, which is very progressive.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's more like finding the right things to
finding
put
the
full
right
force
things,
behind and then really make something impressive and impactful.
Yeah.
And Brian, you're nodding along to that. Are you finding it difficult to keep the gates closed, as it were?
Not so much, but I think it's a very valid point in that, particularly if you look at platforms as a service or software as a service now, you invest in these technologies and you don't necessarily fully understand the whole scope of what they can do. So you're blinkered and you focus, we want it to do this bit, but you don't understand that it could do all these other things as well. And they're changing features constantly. I mean, the rollout, if you look at AWS and the numerous updates that they bring out and the new features. And if you've got a development team or you've got a team of engineers, they might suddenly rush off and they want to do a proof of concept and they want to go and try it, and they can do, but without that proper scrutiny. Obviously, I work in the security industry, so I'm always worried that they might suddenly create an AWS bucket and they haven't put the right security around it, and suddenly they dump some data in it and it's exposed. And we know that that's happened quite a lot within technology, and a number of companies have been caught out. And so it's them having the ability to be able to do that, and like you said, for fun or just to be able to play and let's go and see whether or not this new technology might do anything for us, but then not actually turning it off afterwards, and then suddenly you get a bill and it's absolutely massive. Where did that come from? Oh, it's because Joe was playing around and fired up 15 instances of God knows what it was and forgot to turn it off afterwards. You know, it's not really understanding the technology fully before you jump in with both feet.
I suppose it sounds though like there's a bit of a mixed message here. On the one hand, we're sort of saying experiment, go out, try new stuff. There's a whole new world out here, you know, embrace it. And on the other hand, we're going, but don't get it wrong. And that's quite stifling, isn't it?
Well, as just hearing what I was saying and on the discussion, I don't think any of us are saying we shouldn't have innovation, and that is really important. It's something about knowing why you're doing it and knowing if it's if it's very short term to prove a concept, that's fine. But for some things not to happen by accident, to sprawl and become unmanageable and frankly not very useful or valuable in the medium long term. I think getting that outside view of, I mentioned earlier, didn't I, what we can get from digital natives and initiatives and AWS, fantastic innovation going on there. We should lap it all up by seeing what's out there and what's possible, but it does need leadership to make sure it's all going to make some impact.
And it needs the resources within the company to be able to do that. So you can't have the guy that's looking after the production systems at the same time playing around with the development systems or doing the proof of concepts. Yeah. You know, it helps to have a team of people that are purely focused on that. What benefit can you bring back to the business by using those new technologies, and separate that out from the current technologies that you're using to make sure that you're giving the best service possible to your users. As you said, focus on your users.
So that's an organisational change in a way, isn't it? You're saying we need a separate department that is specifically dealing with this and not dealing with the day-to-day as well.
So again, I would propose a slightly alternative view to that as well, because I think the shift that's happened in technology over the last decade, maybe even longer, is the technology function is not so isolated from the business, right? So most technology leaders would say, yes, I'm part of this business leadership and technology is my primary language, but I'm here to run a business and to make sure that our customers are being served. And I really loved what Enrique said about the focus on the customer and that goal being the end result. And the alternative view I would propose is, I know in my area and with the companies I've worked in, the focus has really been on getting our technologists to be more commercial and more business savvy, not less. Right, so if they do want to do these experiments, they do want to try this new technology, can they articulate how this is going to be valuable to the business? Can they articulate, okay, this is something I can do that I think may be beneficial to a customer? It may end up not being, but can they articulate in such a way rather than, we're just playing games and I'm just doing something because I read a blog on the new technology and I just want to play around with it. So that's something that I really challenge my teams to, is how do we articulate trying that new thing in a way that is going to help our business and help our customers. And I think that's really important. I think most businesses are trying to move in that direction as well. Most technology leaders I hear talk about, I'm here to serve the business. I'm here part of leading this business, not just to sit in my techie box and play around with wires and gadgets.
And you need a lot of communication, don't you, between the two? You know, I was just thinking in my job, I could say, well, you know, I'm a journalist, I tell stories every day. Here is a tool that I think would really help me do my job. And I speak to somebody who's not a journalist and doesn't do this stuff every day. And I think, well, you know, you don't understand. I'm doing it all the time. I know what I need.
Yeah.
But perhaps I don't, because what that person has that I don't have is the bigger picture. Maybe I'm the only person that needs that tool, and therefore, you know, there is not a business case. So you need that sort of symbiotic relationship, don't you?
You've got to have it, because otherwise it could be the fact that the other person doesn't understand what your job is. You know, so when I worked at the BBC, the benefit I had in working in the department I did was that I went around to all of the other departments, and I would listen to what it is that they're trying to do, and then you've got to find the solution that matches. And the solution that matches BBC News might have an impact on what BBC Sport was doing. So you had to find that common ground, and I had the benefit of being able to share what BBC Monitoring were doing with BBC Worldwide, which turned out to be very, very similar. So it's like, guys, you should sort of join up rather than be isolated. If you're going to ignore your staff when they say, look, we need this tool because we need to do this, then you're not going to succeed. You need to be able to give them what they want, but they also need to meet you halfway, and that you have to do it in a structured approach. It has to meet the end goals of the entire company, not just one particular individual.
And that's always going to be easier for a nimble startup, isn't it? If there's only 10 of you in the room, then you all know what you're doing. Once you get beyond that stage, you know, we're talking about different divisions of a big organisation, you lose that agility.
It's not only that what you do, but also is the speed of the cycles of these things. So one of the temptations is to move on to the next piece very quickly, and people cannot catch up with it and get puzzled, and you know some people don't like computers, let's face it, and we need to be very careful how we implement these things and respect the cycles of embedding the change before the next fancy thing.
We've spent a lot of time talking about things we don't like. Let's have a focus for a minute on stuff that we think is worth investing in. You know, what kind of areas perhaps do you think are worth pursuing at the moment? I know it's really hard and everything is so faddy, isn't it? But you know, if you had to pick an area that you think successful businesses should be investing in, what would it be?
I think from my point of view, and I say it to my biz ops team all the time, I think one of the biggest technical capabilities we've really pushed into business are collaboration tooling. Right, which is not, okay, my developers doing some really amazing things. It's not the machine learning team doing some really amazing things, but the ability for us to work flexibly and remotely wherever we are is transformational for us as a business. It enables our staff, to your point, the people that we work with on a day-to-day basis, to be themselves, to bring them whole selves to work, and not always to work in the building, but to work from home or from wherever is convenient for them. And that ability took a lot of work. That's a lot of technology involved. It's not necessarily, okay, my software engineering department building something for my customers, but that is really transformational. I think that is, you're seeing bigger pushes in that for many players as we look at working with a different type of workforce, and how can technology enable us to do that. And also our customers want to want to interact with us in different ways. 9 to 5, yeah, that's great, but customers, their businesses still run after 5 o'clock, and they start before 9 o'clock, and they would like to interact in different ways, and enabling our staff to operate in very different flexible ways, flexible hours, flexible modes, enables us to serve our customers in a different way. And that wouldn't be possible without leveraging technology very heavily and cost effectively, right? The alternative is, you have more people spending a lot more time, and it's a very inefficient way of delivering that service. But by leveraging technology, we get to serve those customers in that flexible way. And I think that's been quite transformational for us and many other businesses that I know of.
I think we're touching on some of the sort of almost foundational pieces that become the springboard for everything else that we would like potentially to happen in the future. So I totally agree with what, if we're investing in the digital workplace where everyone can work flexibly and in the right way and securely, etc., that's fantastic. And by the way, when we were talking before about the innovation and where that should be, I kind of think we can also obsess too much about sort of a over simplistic question. Should it be centralized or decentralized? It's probably both, and it all just depends. And Brian, you probably have a bird's eye view of huge amount that goes on across your organisation. We all do in our different ways, and to be connectors across the different teams, I think helps hugely. And we're really getting into culture. If people have a culture where they have all the right tools to be able to work flexibly in the way that suits them to be able to be productive, it's brilliant. We've got all the tools to do that. Then you kind of get to the next level, people being able to work together. Leadership is about getting the right groups to work effectively together. And then it just happens quite furtively. It just starts to, the innovation can happen itself. Now, there are times when innovation may need to be ring-fence funded separately or whatever, but I think it's just not a one-size-fits-all. And I like to think that although governance always sounds like it's putting a dampener and controlling everything, I actually don't believe that's the case. I think when an organisation and the technology use is well governed, it actually allows you to see everything that's good and not so good, to make really good investment decisions based on the wider purpose. And it's really, really liberating, because then everyone can then move on to these other more innovative, progressive things. I see you nodding your head, and if you had any examples,
I think you're absolutely right. I'm sort of reminded of the days when it was, welcome to your job. You're going to be sat here. You're going to be sat next to that person probably for the next 4 to 5 years, and then once a week you'd get together as a team or as a department, and you'd hear what everybody else is doing. And with the advent of agile working, you have the ability to sit down in these groups as and when per project, and that makes a huge difference and really, really benefits the company.
It's a very common question in interviews as well, isn't it? I mean, people now ask overtly, will I be able to work remotely, flexibly, or whatever?
Yeah.
And perhaps 10 years ago, that might have seemed a little odd question to ask before you'd started your role. But actually, it's just taking advantage of what we can do in this modern world.
Sure. And it's phasing out now, but there are still evidence of managers that kind of believe that it's bums on seats. So if I can't see you sitting there working, then I don't believe that you're working. I don't trust that you're actually working from home when you say that you're working from home. And thankfully now that's phasing out, and there's that level of trust that's coming back in, and therefore the feeling that by being given the opportunity to work from home, I will reward you by putting in the effort and making sure that I'm delivering. It's really, really important, particularly
at least it's clear when people do need to be in a particular place for a particular reason, whether it's a controlled environment.
So it sounds like flexible working is very much a common characteristic, we think, going forward for a successful company to survive.
I think as leaders we're grappling with this. I mean, we're almost talking about these things that on the face of it can seem diametrically opposed ideas. We're almost contradicting ourselves out of the other sentence, but it's a complex world, and we're no longer in a one-size-fits-all monolithic type of environment. And I think that is the future. And how senior leaders, whether they're company execs, not just technologists such as ourselves, need to understand that and be able to grapple with that. And that's a complicated world. I think that's where we are important connectors across the organisation to help people make sense of that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah. The other thing, the reason why I go to work is to find solutions to problems, as opposed to come with solutions that look for problems.
That's an old tech
yeah,
issue.
But it is true. It is an issue. So I've got a great example of what the future will bring in terms of technology, which is we've got a big vehicle which works on diesel, and we also have ultra-low emission zones being built in cities, and the two things don't work with each other well. But what's clear is that the solution is not the car either. So what we've done is recently now we're experimenting with using geofencing for driving a hybrid vehicle. Works on diesel and parts where there is not a problem. As soon as it hits that ultra-low emission, switches onto electric. That for me is, we're going to see more in the future. We're going to see more of use of technology for real problems. There was a real problem. Cities are polluted, and part of, as well as taking the cars of it, we also have to find solutions to that problem.
And we've got a great sort of another example of flexibility there in a way, haven't you? It's a problem that requires more than one solution.
It requires more than one solution.
But aren't you then just shifting the problem so that in years to come, the areas where you're using the diesel become polluted because the cities are no longer polluted because you're not using the diesel there?
Possibly, and I'm sure that the solution in the end is electric vehicles, and we've got the largest electric bus depot in Europe, which is around the corner actually from here. But it's you need to do things one at a time.
Sure.
You just cannot implement electric everywhere because no one's got enough money for that, not even the government. So you need to, yes, it will be kind of, but by then hopefully the electric technology will be a lot cheaper and
So
a lot
this is
easier
a kind of
to implement.
interim solution.
Yeah, but it's a solution to a real problem.
I was actually just going to ask, where do the ideas, mentioned geofencing and all sorts of interesting twists and ways of what is possible and applying that to your solutions. Like where do the ideas tend to come from?
It comes from real problems that get discussed with real suppliers. So this came from a supplier that found, I can imagine the person that came with the idea with one of those eureka moments in the shower saying, I know how to sort this. It's by communicating and talking to people and the supplier partners and partnering with them on these things.
So that's interesting. Talk a little bit about outside influences and seeing what might be possible. It can seem very fluffy just to be looking out there, it's very geeky looking and see what's changing in the world. But with structured conversations about what an organisation is trying to do and then sharing that with suppliers for outside technology firms and other experts and even across different industries, I think it's incredible when you suddenly, a conversation takes a different twist to create something that you probably would never have thought of without that different stimulation.
What can be difficult there is that businesses can be very proprietary and secretive, and they don't necessarily want to reveal, a weakness. Here's a problem we can't solve. They don't really want their shareholders to know that necessarily, or indeed their competitors. Are we back now to needing more culture change to facilitate, more examples of that really simple bit of innovation?
I think there has been a cultural shift in the business world in sharing. I know when I first entered the business world and started my career, sharing was not a thing, right? Every business did their own thing. You weren't interested in partnerships. You wanted to take over and do your own thing, really. Whereas today, I think we're not at the end state yet, but I think today now everybody is looking for those right partnerships that's going to work for their different businesses, and creating their own ecosystems that's going to have mutual benefits for the participants there. And I think that's the end goal. The end goal is, yes, these ecosystems are going to be in place, and we're all on that journey of working out how are we all going to coexist in this partnership world.
What kind of partnerships do you mean? Can you elaborate on that?
So we have many partnerships already. So for us to service the insurance for our customers, we work with insurers. We also work with aggregators who are specialists in acquiring customers, as we do ourselves. We work with the search optimization, search engines on how can we publicize ourselves, work with marketing agencies and things of that nature. So that is one level of partnership. But you can also imagine other levels of partnership where you say, okay, how do we create an ecosystem that really brings value to our customers? So our customers are small businesses. Small businesses have other needs other than insurance. So they have banking needs. So can we connect with banking partners? They also have other needs of other services that they require, whether that be accounting or whatever other things that small businesses require. Those where you can start to imagine different types of ecosystems that don't all exist today. In the traditional old school method, a player would have said, I want to be that thing. So I want to create all of those services for a customer. I want to be that one-stop shop. In today's world, it's much more common to expect, we are going to have the best of breed. However, I don't want a separate relationship with those best of breed. I want them to work together and to integrate and make my life as a consumer easier. And I think that is where we're seeing technology really helping to connect things together. However, the relationship between businesses is getting closer, but in a very different way. And it's all centered around the customer. Going back to Enrique's point, everybody is focused on how do I service the customer and who is going to be kind of that primary player in that customer relationship. We talked about Amazon and how they have created an ecosystem of thousands of businesses interacting with customers, but they are the ecosystem or the ecosystem that all these customers interact with. And many of us in different businesses are looking at how do we make sure that we can service our customers, leveraging the capabilities of various other businesses, not having to do it myself, but doing so in a way that is not making yourself redundant, and just, okay, it's all about the ecosystem, adding value, but we're doing it in a very special way.
So the one-stop shop is no more?
I don't think so. And the same applies to suppliers, not just partnerships in commercial partnership. I don't think the big ERP suppliers are going to survive unless they change fundamentally the way they do business. I think they're going to struggle. It's typically the people that sell you stuff and only talk to you when they sell you stuff. I think they're up for a problem.
You do in the near future.
Oh yeah, and I think that the whole that same concept of ecosystems will be applied to the supplier base, not just to the commercial forefront of the organization, and we'll end up working with people that we work in partnership with, as opposed to the traditional supplier-client relation.
And what is the mistake that they're making, do you think?
It's not listening to their customer. We don't want to buy an application, we want to implement something that does the job for the customer or the employee. And until they listen, they're up for a surprise if they don't, yeah.
I think it's with the proliferation of best of breed SaaS applications that you can sign up to. I mean, it's been possible for some time, worked in organizations that have really well integrated best of breed applications, but that requires lots of careful planning, and when it works, it's as good or better than a monolithic traditional ERP type solution. I think there still will be a place for that, but perhaps in a very, very controlled, very strict process-based, perhaps manufacturing type of environment, but definitely lack the agility, don't you, in that environment, and people want that. If I may just make a point about relationships with outside partnerships, actually. I think, for example, the museum is very privileged to be working with, have fantastic partnerships with likes of Dell, which we call actually our digital supporter relationship. And it's really strategic. Not only does it help send Diplodocus on tour around the UK, it's great for a fantastic educational engagement, powering the digital workplace. We've just been talking about empowering high performance computing for really purposeful scientific research, solving problems of humanity, actually. And then we've also got a really deep relationship with Cisco as a digital supporter, powering the museum's networks, which again is not a traditional networking environment where it's not like you have 100 or 1,000 people in a traditional office environment. It's people that need to come and go and get access to different things, and the 15,000 sensors around the museum that need to get access to what they need in a secure, controlled environment. So I think there's perhaps a move to having multiple strategic relationships, probably moving away from very fragmented transactional relationships to understanding a few partners that have a lot of different resources and ideas and technologies they can bring to bear, and there's really close. And I think of it as an uncovering of if people share their plans quite deeply, what their aspirations are, even if it's not completely polished, there's a lot that can come out of these discussions about what's possible.
The only thing I would say, and you mentioned some really interesting collaborations there, but they're big names, Dell, Cisco, you see it a lot in the tech sector. Facebook says we're going to collaborate, and then it's with Google and Netflix and Amazon, and you think, okay, well, these are the giants collaborating with each other, 'twas ever thus. But how are the smaller firms, the startups, if you like, the possible Googles of the future going to get a look in if everybody's all tied up with each other?
I think it's challenging. But I also think when you think of the startups, they don't want to stay as startups, right? So their aim is to become a digital giant themselves. So Netflix wasn't the behemoth that it is today, or when it started, it was the startup. It was the small fish in a big pond, and it's grown leveraging technology. And I think those are some of the stories that many of us in leadership look to and say, we don't want to be left behind. Right, so we do want to make sure that we've got a capability around technology so that we don't miss the shift. So Enrique talked about electric buses. That was a decision that they took a while back to say, we think we might need to invest in this. we don't want to be left behind in that capability. And same thing for us. I think you have to look at, these are some of the trends. We're not going all in because we don't fully understand it, but we do, to Brian's point, we do want to learn about these capabilities. So when the right opportunity comes along, we can leverage it. And I think the bigger partners, your Azures, your Amazons, et cetera, who are kind of consolidating in different spaces, they will propose different types of problems, right? So they will then become that the legacy type organization that starts to feel a bit prohibitive and a bit slower if they go down that path. I think they've been quite careful in trying to keep their services as independent as possible, to keep that nimbleness. Whereas traditionally, once you were in with one of the big players, you were kind of consumed, and there was a lot of kind of lock-in that took part of those contracts. Whereas the players today, they want you to consume all of their services, but I think they're quite sensitive to make sure that you've got the independence and freedom to pick and choose to a certain extent.
Brian, you're agreeing with that?
Well, I was just thinking, they don't become big, do they? They just become bought. That's what happens now, you know. So a startup comes up with a great new idea. Eventually a Google or a Facebook takes a look at it and thinks that's nice, bungs a couple of billion their way, and then they suddenly disappear, and in 10 years' time you've never heard of them, because what was Instagram is now Facebook photos or something like that, and it's quite worrying.
It is an interesting question as we're thinking about Futuregazing. Not sure where that does take us in 10 years or 20 years from now.
I love working with startups and small organizations if they have the right attitude and behavior. There's something in it for both. So they have an aspiration to growth, but they want to do it in a sensible way as opposed to a crazy way. And we want to work with them well for our customers. So we've got 3 years ago, there was no contactless in buses in the UK, and we worked with a fintech company, really small place, so small that it's called Little Pay. And now everybody in the UK has got it. And it was a pleasure to work with them, still is. And little by little, and they've got the right behavior. We work truly, we're not going to exploit them so we break them, and we want them to make money because otherwise they won't survive. And they want us to succeed because then they can sell the case to other people. It's brilliant when it works. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. I really do.
I think there's a sense that traditional, bigger, older businesses are afraid, aren't they, of the digital native disruptors. But actually, can they coexist? I mean, there is an example of a really nice relationship between great and small, I suppose.
I think they can. I really do. But they all need to consider their customers well. Some of them just don't listen.
And they have so much money to invest, and compared to the smaller companies that can't. I mean, smaller companies, they're passionate about what they're doing, and that's what's great when you work with them, because they want to succeed, and therefore they're flexible, and they'll come to you and they'll go, tell us what's wrong about our product so that we can actually implement your changes to make it a better product. Whereas when you're playing with the bigger guys, they're just like, look, it is what it is. You're either going to buy it or not. Yeah. And you look at companies like Netflix, for example, they're investing billions and billions in their content, but they're actually not turning a profit. So, they can just throw money at it. And there are other smaller players that simply can't do that, and they have to be more frugal with where they're investing and how. So, my worry for 10 years' time is that there's just going to be 3 or 4 big companies that are doing absolutely everything, and that's it. If you want to go and shop, you shop at Amazon. If you want to search, you're going to do it at Google. If you want social media, it's just going to be Facebook, and there is no choice anymore.
So I think there's a couple of things I would add in there as well. I think our traditional big businesses have all had to work in an environment of regulation and rules, right? So our banks, our travel industry, our insurance industry, our retail industry, there've been rules and regulations that have been constraints on those businesses. Whereas a lot of the digital giants that we look at today, they've kind of shifted and operated in without rules, without regulation. So I'm a big fan of Uber. I love the service, and Airbnb, another great service. But they started to operate in a way that Marriott hotels would love to be able to spin up hotels all over the place without any regulation and without that inherent cost of operating in that way. And a lot of these digital businesses have been able to infiltrate different sectors without that regulatory burden and that cost. And I think that is something that may change in the coming years as governments and as societies start to say, this service is great. We're seeing that with Uber in London. The service is great. However, it's not operating in the way that we're happy with. And therefore, you have to operate in this certain way. And that certain way had more cost, which kind of starts to bring you in line with the traditional players who had to operate in that way. So I think that is where things will start to shift, and we'll really start to see which models will really work in that new paradigm. Right? Is your model only going to benefit if you're loss-making? Or will it benefit also once you're turning a profit? Are your customers still going to be happy with that service?
But at the same time, are we providing enough support to these smaller companies to be able to succeed? So whilst the smaller companies are forced, and rightly so, to pay tax, why is it that the bigger companies can get away with paying next to nothing? And therefore it becomes very, very difficult for people, people that remortgage their homes to start a business, and then within 12 months they failed miserably because they've played by the rules, and yet the big fish just think that they can make their own ones up.
I suspect in the next 10 years the landscape may change. We might actually be slightly oversimplifying as well the characterisation of larger versus small, because they're actually, and you touched on some perhaps ERP providers, there are some organisations that may be very large organisations that don't really change, or maybe hanging on to an older model that's perhaps slipping away, and I think eventually will take a downturn. But there are also some very large names that we've referred to, very successful ones that are very innovative, and actually, although there's a big brand name behind the scenes, there's so many product teams, and they can iterate so quickly. That's also fantastic. So it's interesting to see where we will end up.
I mean, I'd agree. I don't think this is a dystopian picture.
No.
I think if you look at business history, there's always been a cycle of you start off small, you got big, and you consumed the other smaller ones, and then somebody else comes along behind you and does the same thing. So there is that evolution. I think you're right. Some will grow and then die off, and some will continue. I mean, I was at a conference maybe 10 years ago, and they talked about how many companies are over 100 years old, right? And there's very few, right? In the grand scheme of how many companies have ever been, the amount that are over a certain period of time is very small. And even if you shorten the timescale to how many businesses are over 20 years old, it's quite a small number, because there is a constant flow of business. And I think technology is just enabling that to happen faster. So as a smaller business, you can get all the services that the big boys have very, very quickly. And so you can grow very quickly, but then the next person who comes along on the ranks can also do it very, very quickly. So that turnover of business ideas is very, very rapid. It's very, very quick.
Since you mentioned ranks and you were just talking about Uber, I just think it's also interesting comparing Uber with a traditional taxi model, because Uber have so much data so that they can, perhaps for all the right reasons, be punished when they're not doing things in the right way. But for the competition, maybe not having any data. So, it's really not having any data to be reviewed in the first place. So one is based on trust and traditional perception of safety, etc. And I'm not saying there are no controls in the older model, but I'm just saying it's hard to compare one with the other. But those things will iron out over time, won't they?
Data is the new currency, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, yeah.
But we are social animals. I'm sure that your museum agrees with that. And we need to be social digital animals. And mesh is going to be the future. We need to find a way of meshing and work in a social way.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good.